In today's world, people feel lost in a sea of ideas. Which ones should we accept? Stay tuned because you're listening to Veracity Hill, striving for truth on faith, politics, and society. Here is your host, Kurt Jarris.
Well, a good day to you, and thanks for joining us here on another episode of Veracity Hill, where we are striving for truth on faith, politics, and society. So nice to be with you here in our offices in downtown West Chicago, in the far western suburbs of the metropolitan city of Chicago. A lot of people get confused when I say I live in West Chicago and work in West Chicago. They think I'm in the western part of the city. No, I'm about an hour west. I like it out here in the suburbs, sort of the edge between rural and urban. But it's very nice to be with you here. Last week, we had a very fine episode, a pre-recorded episode, actually, with Tim Stratton on libertarian free will, the philosophy of how an individual might be free in some circumstance. But it was pre-recorded because the week before I had actually been in Denver for the annual meeting of the Evangelical Theological Society. And just a few days before that, my wife gave birth to our third child. And we've named her Meadow. And so bless Michaela's soul for allowing me to go to Denver and to deliver my paper on some of my research for my doctoral work. It was well received, and it was great to network and see some old friends, make some new ones. Just a wonderful time there. Glad to be back with you, though, here in our offices. So like I said, last week our episode was on libertarian free will, and we had a question from one of our listeners, John. And so to start off, I'm actually going to start this episode with the mailbag. All right, so John writes in. He says, "Hi, Kurt. I've been reading The Scandal of the Evangelical Mind by Mark Knoll, and I have fallen in love with the history of things. History is my second favorite subject behind theology, apologetics, polemics, etc. If I had been available yesterday, when he submitted the question, that is, and if you were taking questions, I may have asked something akin to this. How did a Protestant tradition rooted in the Reformation, Whitefield, Edwards, etc., come to express itself by accepting free will in terms of soteriology, whether full-blown Arminianism, Molinism, or any other view that purports to be in the middle, while the heart of the Reformation stressed human incapacities more than natural human abilities? I think any potential answers to this question may lead to another question, namely, what are some principles of the Enlightenment that continue to shape evangelical thought today?" Well, on our guest today, I'm sure could answer that second question. Let me tackle your first one, John. So you ask again, how did the Protestant tradition, which was rooted in a view of human incapacity, come to be more accepting of free will? Here's what I would say. The Reformation was a movement to combat the sense that one could earn their own salvation, that notion of works righteousness. And so I think what you call full-blown Arminianism or Molinism, these soteriological positions, mind you, Molinism is really a position on divine foreknowledge, they would still affirm with the traditional Protestant view that salvation is a gift from God. It is not something we can earn. Now, whether a human is able to do anything as part of that process, say, for example, the accepting of a gift, that wouldn't be a work per se. And I know there's a disagreement between Calvinists and others on that distinction. So I think that's what I would say is where some of these other later Protestant views came in, they realized, well, there is some sense of human freedom. There is some sense of synergism greater than what the reformers themselves perhaps thought. Very good question. There's lots more that could be said on this, but unfortunately for time, we'll have to move along. But I'm sure to your second question, our guest today can really enlighten us on that. Get it? Enlightenment. Chris, you missed that. All right, our guest today is none other than the reincarnation of Alexis de Tocqueville. He is Os Guinness. He's the author of more than 30 books, including the Global Public Square, A Free People Suicide, Renaissance, Fool's Talk, and Impossible People, which if you remember from was it a year or two ago now? We had Oz to talk about Impossible People. And he's a visiting fellow at the Brookings Institute and a senior fellow at the East-West Institute, a frequent speaker and prominent social critic. He's addressed audiences worldwide. Oz, thank you so much for joining us on our program today.
Kurt, it's always a privilege. Thank you.
Has anyone other than me compared you to Alexis de Tocqueville?
People very generously have. I think on the back of the book, Joe LeConte describes me as an English Tocqueville, which is very kind of him, because no one approaches Alexis de Tocqueville, but it's fun to try.
Yes, you are a modest and humble man as well. So thank you for... Thanks for carving time out of your schedule. I know you've been off traveling, and so I definitely want to thank you for fitting us into your schedule today.
Well, my privilege.
All right. So, Last Call for Liberty is about the status of freedom in America today. And the first question I wanted to ask you, do you draw a distinction between freedom and liberty? And if so, what is that distinction?
I personally don't really. I mean, some people make a difference between the roots of freedom in German forests, which came across to England in the Anglo-Saxon tradition, and liberty, which comes from the Latin word libertas, with a slight, I don't think any of that really much matters either to the founders or to where we are today. You can take liberty and freedom roughly overlapping, but the question is, how do we define it?
Yes, so precisely. So how would you define freedom?
Well, the way I put it, and this is part of the answer to what you were saying in your earlier discussion with the questioner, there are three main streams of liberty in America today. The earliest one partly came across the Puritans. It's what's called the ancient liberties of the English. And that's what does go back through Magna Carta, way back to German forests and so on. And that's Churchill's term, the ancient liberties of the English. And that's certainly one of the streams. But of course, in this 1960s rejection of everything WASP, and now the even more strong rejection of everything connected with white privilege, that sort of view is hardly ever discussed today. The second and far bigger stream is the Reformation. And this is where I think some of your early discussion left out some important factors. The Catholic Church, from the triumph of the Emperor Theodosius, who made Rome Christian, and then copied Roman structures in the church so that the Pope was equivalent to the Caesar. And you had in the Roman Catholic Church hierarchical structures based on power. And it was a Catholic layman, Lord Acton, who made the famous remark that all power tends to corrupt and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And it was those structures borrowed from Rome which led to the Inquisition and the forced baptism of the Jews and various things that Pope John Paul II publicly confessed 60 times. Well, the Reformation didn't go that way. The Reformation went back to the Bible. And you can see the notion in Calvin, Zwingli, Knox, Cromwell in England, the notion, say, of covenantalism. Well, in England, it was behind the English Revolution, but it lost, it failed. And in England, it's called the lost cause. And that view of freedom jumped the Atlantic with the Mayflower, with the Arbella and so on, and became over here the winning cause in New England. And actually, America's founding owes more to the Reformation and its views of freedom and covenant than even many Christians realized, let alone secular people. Now, the third stream today is quite a different one, going back to the French Revolution. And that's really what my book's about, the way ideas that have come down from Rousseau and Voltaire and the French Revolution, Marquis de Sade, Nietzsche, and many, many people since then, they are really through the universities and through the press and media starting to dominate America, and they're very different and they're very disastrous. So I think your question actually didn't understand the Reformation roots of freedom.
Yes, and to his benefit, I think John was asking about the soteriological aspects about individual freedom in the salvation process. But certainly...
But Kurt, Because, people get off immediately into theological discussions.
Yes.
And if the Catholic Church made the mistake of copying Roman structures, evangelicalism made the great mistake of taking, say, books like Exodus and so on, and spiritualizing them and personalizing them, whereas the Reformation saw them as a template for community, for politics. And we've lost that sort of corporate thing. And above all, we've lost the notion of political freedom that came from it. Because the central idea is that a free God, this is behind Exodus, a free God is freeing his people so they can worship him freely. And then, of course, the covenant tells you the way they're supposed to live together.
Right.
Now, we've lost that in many of these completely barren discussions, of predestination and free will and whether we have any freedom and such. We've lost the richness of the Reformation tradition and the Old Testament tradition.
I'm certainly with you there. We've definitely lost that corporate sense, and we can trace that corporate sense throughout history, and that's where we've gone astray, especially on religious freedom, especially the past 20 years or so, 20 to 30 years. And you note here we're getting this sense of freedom now from the French Revolution. So what would you say is the status of freedom in America today?
Well, my book is called The Last Call for Liberty, because I believe we're at a Rubicon moment. In other words, everyone agrees we're deeply divided. The question is, what's the deepest division? So some people say it's just another episode in left against right, or some say it's the coastals, New York, California against the heartlanders. And, of course, the more recent description is it's the globalists against the nationalists and populists. And I think all of those have some merit, but they don't go down to the deepest division of all, which is between those who see America and see freedom in the light of the American Revolution, which was decisively, not fully, sadly, not fully biblical. And those who see America and those who see freedom in the light of the ideas that have flown from the French Revolution. But you take things like political correctness, postmodernism, tribal politics, the sexual revolution, every one of those and others, they go back to 1789 and its heirs, and they're thoroughly anti-biblical. And you look at, say, the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, and the Chinese Revolution, they're all the pair. And they were all disastrous for freedom. And they produced a regime that was worse than the one before. And they produced their reigns of terror and their killing fields. And it will be disastrous for America if in the next 10 years or so there's a decisive lurch to the left. The trouble is, unlike the 1850s and 60s, there's no Lincoln. And the difference is that Lincoln addressed the problems, the evil, say, of slavery, in the light of what he called the better angel of the American nature, or in the light of the Declaration. Even Martin Luther King viewed the Declaration of Independence as a promissory note. In other words, it was there promising something, freedom and equality, but it was never cashed in, and the civil rights movement tried to cash it in. But if you look at the movement since then, from Stokely Carmichael right down to today, they don't believe in the Declaration of Independence. Take, say, the kneeling controversy, and so on. And you can see we're on the edge of the triumph of ideas that are absolutely inimical to the American Revolution.
If we could try to survey American history, when would we say this shift began away from the movement that the founders had envisioned?
Well, you can see three periods of shifts, but it's the third one I'll mention that's the deepest. One is the Charles Beard and Parrington and people like that, who in the early 20th century accused the framers of having a quasi-Marxist agenda. In other words, they were Virginia plantation owners, and they really had these high-flown views of freedom, but they wanted to keep the slaves down. And you can see from then onwards, right down to people like Howard Zinn, in the current public school curricula, you have that view. Then you have the progressives, from Woodrow Wilson to Barack Obama. And they say, in effect, framers were great, maybe. in their time. But we're in a different time, and we're progressing, and we're beyond their ideas. And so we've got a new world. We need new ways. But I think the real objection is deeper. It's those who look at the evils that were in the Constitution, say the 3 Fifths clauses. In other words, they say, for all that promise of freedom and equality, there was an evil and there was hypocrisy, so we throw out baby bathwater and all. So Lincoln said, we tackle the evil, but in the light of the promise. They say, no, we reject the whole thing. Now, when did that actually happen? I think, myself, in the 60s. So Martin Luther King, in his great I Have a Dream speech, talked to the promissory note. Stokely Carmichael rejected the whole thing. And somewhere with the rise of the anti-Vietnam War, radical feminism, somewhere around 1968, I choose 68 because that was the year that Rudy Deutschke, the leader of the Red Brigade, called for a long march through the institutions. In other words, picking up Gramsci, who replaced the ideas of Karl Marx with a much subtler understanding of how you win revolutions through the dominance of the elites, the gatekeepers. So you have a long march through the institutions. Now, we're exactly 50 years on from Deutschke, and you can see that the universities and colleges, they've been won. Press and media, largely won. And the world of entertainment and Hollywood, largely won by the liberal left. So I think America's very close to the trouble is many Republicans don't understand it. You take, say, the president's ideas of making America great again. He never asked what made it great in the first place. It wasn't, in fact, the military, and it wasn't the economy. It was actually ideas, but he never tackles those. So somewhere around the 60s, the fateful lurch left took place.
If we could think of potential solutions for, weird to use this term, salvaging the situation, what are some ideas that we could bring back in order to win those people back over to the cause of liberty?
Well, first we need leadership. And I've spoken 3 times in the Senate in the last few months and said quite bluntly, which of you will take such a lead as Lincoln did, addressing today's evils in the light of the better angels, and really believing in the Declaration and the founding documents. So we need leadership with courage, with vision, and so on. But there needs to be a real understanding that is the issue. Do you go to this view of freedom or that view of freedom? And do you see what the choice means and the consequences that will come, whichever you take? But then, among other things, we need a restoration of civic education. You remember the old motto, e pluribus unum. You know, it was called the melting pot, the way the public schools were not just free universal education, but they were free education that taught the first things of what it meant to be American, the unum. No one does that now. No one has a clue what the unum is. Whether I'm working with CEOs or college students or church people, I often ask them, get a piece of paper and write down 10 things that are part of the unum, the uniting first principles that all Americans should subscribe to. Hardly anyone can get beyond 1 or 2. Now, in other words, we need a restoration of the civic education. Because go back, I mentioned the covenant. The rabbis point out rightly, what did Moses speak about the night of the Passover? Hundreds of years of slavery, and they're going free tonight. Did he talk about freedom? No. Did he talk about the promised land of milk and honey? No. Did he talk about the howling desert they had to cross? No. He talked about children. 3 times he refers to children. In other words, to really have freedom, you've got to pass it down from parents to children, from teachers to students. It's got to live in the hearts and minds, or freedom dies. And so we need a restoration of civic education, teaching kids and teaching new immigrants who arrive what it is to be American. And of course, I think also at a very different level, this is not the public square. We need a revival of faith right across the church, because the scandal of the American church is that we're a huge majority in the country, but we have less cultural influence then tiny groups, the transgenders are less than 1% of America. The LGBT, less than 2 or 3% of America. And yet they have far more cultural influence than we do. Shame on us. We're not salty and light-bearing. And we need to cry out to the Lord for revival and reformation among his people, starting with each of us.
So you talked about how we need to have good leaders. Who might be some people you could think of in American history that we could look to? I know you mentioned Lincoln and you mentioned MLK. Who are some other folks we could look into and explore their ideas to begin adapting them for today's society?
Well, obviously, the founding generation was an extraordinary generation of leaders. And I would say, you think, I'm English, you think of Churchill in World War II, or you think of Athens and Pericles. Often nations are thrown up individual great leaders. But what's remarkable about your founding is there's a whole group of them all in the same generation. So they're incredible. But the reason I focus on Lincoln is because America today is as deeply divided as it was just before the Civil War, although there were different things. And Lincoln understood that. And we need leadership that understands that and addresses it today. So, I've been in Washington more than 30 years. I've only heard 2 people on Capitol Hill really speak with any understanding of history. And almost nobody today is addressing what I think are the real problems. I mean, the senators decrying incivility. Well, I wrote on incivility years ago, and certainly that's a problem. But it's not the cause of the division. That's the consequence. So we need leadership that really addresses the real problems.
I remember I was listening to one of the Republican primary debates, and I believe Senator Rand Paul had quoted from one of your books, and so on national television. I'm sure that was quite. I'm not sure if you were watching at that time, but maybe you heard about it at that time. What an awesome opportunity!
I was watching. I almost fell off my chair.
That's great.
No, but Senator Rand Paul is a man of independent thinking and real courage. I haven't spoken to him about some of these things.
Sure.
And I hope if I sent him a copy of my book, I hope if he appreciates it, he will speak and address some of these things. But there are relatively few who can do that. I mean, our wonderful Christian brother, Senator Ben Sass, has an extraordinary grasp of history. 2 good books out now, latest one being Them. But he still is not addressing what I think is the deepest issue.
All right, let's move along a little bit. So, if America were to lose our freedom, which maybe it's just my because sometimes there are fear tactics out there, and sometimes people buy into the fear. So it's my perception that and yours as well, that we're losing freedom. So what will happen in America as we continue to go down this road?
Well, it'll be with specific freedoms. You take, say, the closing of the American mind, the stifling of free speech on campuses. So the universities are the finishing schools of freedom. But instead of being bastions of freedom, they're shutting down speech. Or you mentioned earlier, freedom of religion and conscience. That used to be America's first liberty. And America's done better than any nation in history, maybe for 300-odd years. But in the last 20 years, we've had a greater sea change over freedom of religion and conscience than in the previous 300. You just I call them the 3 dark R's, but leave out the first 2. The third one are what I call the rebranders. In other words, they've taken freedom of religion and turned it into a code word for bigotry and discrimination. And they're attacking it now. Well, they're not only undermining a very basic human right, they're challenging something that's deeply liberal, the right to dissent, and the right of conscientious moral objection. But so we're seeing it's person by person. It's a florist like Baron Stutzman, or a baker like Jack Phillips, or someone squelched in, say, Charles Murray visiting a New England college. and they're squelched one by one by one by one. And that's already begun to happen in ways that are extremely troubling.
And you use that term liberal in the classical sense, not necessarily in the contemporary sense. Liberal meaning free to do something. Whereas in our contemporary discussions, it carries a different connotation, right?
Well, that's part of what I call that fateful lurch left in the 60s. I mean, up till 60s, America was a liberal project in the 19th century sense of the term. In other words, the protection of the freedom of the individual above all over against the government and the state. But then in that lurch left, it became the promotion of progressive ideas through the use of the government, regardless of the individual. So I think the word liberal is far too important. In other words, its roots are in freedom and generosity, a liberal generosity. So I will never give up the word liberal, but I disagree strongly with those who are secular progressives in this left-wing way, who have nothing to do with real freedom in its classical sense.
Yes. All right, Oz, we've got to take a short break here. It's just about a 90-second break from our sponsors. When we come back, though, we've got more questions for you. And before we part here, if you're watching the live stream on Facebook right now, I want to encourage you to share the video and comment on the live stream here. And if you share the video, we're giving away one copy of Oz's book here, The Last Call for Liberty: How America's Genius for Freedom Has Become Its Greatest Threat. So stick with us through this short break from our sponsors.
You're listening to Veracity Hill, striving for truth on faith, politics, and society.
Evangelical Christians are talking about hell. What if we believe what we believe because we've always believed it? What if the gospel is really a matter of life and death? We want you to open your mind, open your Bible, and rethink hell. At rethinkinghell.com, evangelicals look at what the Bible says about hell, putting conventional and controversial views to the test.
Have you heard of the Google Ad Grant for nonprofits? 501c3 nonprofit organizations can receive $10,000 per month in online advertising credit from Google, empowering you to share your message with the world. At Defenders Media, we partnered with Nonprofit Megaphone, an agency focused solely on Google grant acquisition and management. They got us approved for the grant and now manage ad campaigns, bringing hundreds of new people to our websites each month. If you are eligible, Nonprofit Megaphone will acquire and manage the grant for you for a month for free to see if they can help you too. Visit nonprofitmegaphone.com to learn more. Thanks for sticking with us through that short break from our sponsors. If you'd like to learn how you can become a sponsor or just a patron, that's someone who chips in a few bucks a month to our program, you can go to our website, veracityhill.com. This is episode 124. We've been bringing new content to you week after week for over 2 years now. It's been such a blessing to do so, and we would love to continue to expand our program and our offering. We're actually in talks with a radio network right now to begin for the first time airing our program over the radio waves in a smaller city in America, but it's a start, and we would love to get your support in our doing so. I'm looking back in our older episodes here. Episode 18 was when we interviewed Oz last, Impossible People. That's when his book came out, and so that was a great, I really had my fanboy come out in me. Oz, I'm not sure if you remember that, but that was a fun interview for me.
No, I enjoyed it.
All right, so we're talking about freedom and liberty, the status of freedom in America today. And my guest is none other than the social critic Os Guinness. And at least for me, his reputation precedes him on our program today. And again, if you're just joining us, if you share the video and comment, we're giving away Oz's book, The Last Call for Liberty, which is recently published by IVP Books. Okay, Oz, I want to ask you, you've talked many times about pluralism in society and how pluralism is a good solution forward so that freedom can exist in our society, continue to exist. Tell us a little bit about what pluralism is and how it can be helpful.
Well, slightly change what I would believe there, Kurt. I would say pluralism is just a social fact. In other words, there are a lot of people with a lot of different ideas, different cultures, different religions, different languages, different backgrounds. Pluralism is a social fact. Now, you move from the fact to the philosophy. That's relativism. Now, you and I would strongly disagree with relativism. Yep. I would say pluralism is a fact. Relativism is dead wrong. Then you move, say, to the policy of multiculturalism. And I think that's very misguided, which has produced, identity politics, tribal politics, victim politics, all that sort of nonsense, extremely dangerous. So I distinguish pluralism as a social fact. And the fact is, in the last 50 years, the technical term is called pluralization. Now, that's the process. Things like travel, the media, scholarship, migration. Put all these things together, they produced what's now called the place where everyone is now everywhere. So America's been much more pluralistic from the beginning than most countries. And the only real parallel where we are today is the Roman Empire, which had incredible diversity, but it was Mediterranean. Whereas now, pluralism is virtually global. And you can go almost anywhere in the world and you'll see a huge amount of differences from cuisines and restaurants right up to worldviews. But I distinguish between the social fact, that's pluralism. We can't deny it, whether you like it or not, it's here. And then I disagree with relativism, I disagree with multiculturalism, and I try and work out how we live with that fact, which is through freedom of conscience for everybody.
And that fact can be very helpful because it's a truth that many people can't deny, and thereby you're saying it's indicative that we should have this freedom because without it, tyranny results. And this is something that the founders really wanted to set up structures to prevent from happening. And I want to read an excerpt from your book here, which I think just brilliantly explains this. You write, the problem of the abuse of power was what the founders' ordering of freedom was designed to answer in the first place, with its constitutional framework, its separation of powers, its checks and balances, its underlying realism about the abuse of power, and its insistence on civic education and the golden triangle of freedom. There were to be rules of the contest for all the players, rules for the contest to be fair for all the players, and rules for the contest to remain a contest and not a brawl. Which means that the rules of the contest had to be accepted and respected by all the players, with no exception. And you say all that broke down in the 2016 election. Tell us more. How did we see all of that break down? It was really, this didn't come out of left field. It's the culmination of decades of political punches, partisan politics, the loss of civility. But tell us more.
Well, I think if you analyze the progress of this revolution, another revolution really coming from 1789, not 1776, there are various milestones that are important to notice. One was certainly the presidential election of 2016. Another one was the hearing surrounding Judge Brett Kavanaugh. And you can see there, even following 2016, you can see there the rejection of process, the rejection of the presumption of innocence, the reliance on, alleged facts which are cooked up, and the reliance on crowds hammering with violence and so on. You can trace the breakdown of these things. What will be next? I don't know. Editors cut out of my book a paragraph I had on the fact that when words break down, conflict and violence are never far away. And one of the dangers is the scapegoating. Think of René Girard's stuff. The scapegoating which could lead to an assassination. And I still have deep concerns for something like that, but it was cut out of my book. But I do think the revolution is actually spiraling down still. And each side is concerned about the other, but nobody is doing the Lincoln, addressing the real roots of the problem in the light of the better angels of the American Revolution. Literally no one.
Well, hopefully someone will stand up. Dear God, I hope someone stands up.
No, I do too.
You write that Americans are asleep in their churches, they're asleep in their homes, they're asleep to the cause and importance of liberty. What do you mean by that? Well,
liberty is just a cliche in this country. You know, how many times I've heard the good F's, faith, freedom, and family, just roll off the tongue. But if you look at history, take the history of civilization, you know, if you put it down to a compressed single hour, free societies only come in the last 5 minutes. And they're rare, and they're fleeting. And Americans think, we're free, we're free, we're free, we'll stay free forever. That is really foolish. Freedom never, ever lasts. The framers knew that. They had a system for sustaining freedom. We either don't know what it is, or there are many people in this country who openly reject it. And so there's an incredible sleepy complacency, call it naivety, call it what you like. Americans aren't saying, what is freedom and how do we sustain it? Where are we now? And so on. And we're at a very, very critical period.
I can think here from your previous book, Impossible People, you wrote about St. Peter Damian. And remind us a little bit about who St. Peter Damian was.
Well, that book was a book to Christians. And Peter Damian is not well known, say, like Martin Luther or Francis of Assisi. But in the 11th century, Peter Damian was a reformer in a time of financial, sexual, moral corruption of the church, which was pretty extreme, as parts of the church are today. But he was so sold out to Jesus, he was called the impossible man. In other words, he couldn't be manipulated. He couldn't be bribed. He was incorruptible, unbribable, as George Orwell said later, unclubbable. In other words, he didn't just become a member of a group and get along and go along and all that. And he was he was Christ's man. And we need Christians today who are like that.
Yeah, so, and here I asked you that because I'm drawing a connection here, because you talk about Americans in general are asleep on their own liberty. But if I, as a Christian and someone who's, you know, studying theology and you know, speak at churches, if I could talk to Christians for a moment, I would say we need to be like Peter Damian in America today, looking at our American values and virtue that we can continue to promote and advocate for in the public square. So we need to be like Peter Damian, not just as a Christ follower, but a Christ follower in America. All right, so how does religious history inform the current crisis of freedom, especially religious freedom, in America today?
Well, I wouldn't say religious history, I'd just say history. And you know all the many, many statements from Goethe and Winston Churchill and hundreds of others who point out that unless you know history, you don't have any real sense of identity and are incapable of moving well into the future. And yet a lack of history is one of the features of, say, Americans today, including many Christians. They're just not interested in history, which is absolutely crazy. Another thing that's very closely related to that is reading books. And you can see the younger generation, you know, everything on the internet, they don't actually read that many books, and that's absolutely disastrous. So the thoughtful Christians are people who need to understand history. No, we don't have to read as a historian reads history. But, for instance, I take a lot of my history in through biographies, which are a much more personal and colorful way of understanding a period. But we need history. and we need to read books, which are the central source of maintaining wisdom.
It really is astounding. The the younger generation, they're on the internet. It's we're in the information age, and yet the ability to process that information, it's inept. It's just I think here there was this a comedy. I'm not sure if you've ever seen it. Speaking of entertainment, right? Called Idiocracy. And it's a fascinating comedy because it starts off with an interesting premise that intelligent people tended to have a fewer amount of kids. They would spend more time on their careers and studying, and then they only had like 1 or 2 kids, or maybe they didn't have any. And the less intelligent people in a society have many kids. And just over time, what would happen is the less intelligent people would have the greater aspect of the population. And eventually these people would they couldn't process information. They couldn't think constructively or critically. And these were the people of society. And so some people have even compared, it's funny, I think the president of America, it was like, 200 years in the future or something like that. I forget what it was. Chris, I'm not sure if you've seen it. You're a movie guy. I think President Camacho, people have compared Trump to President Camacho. And really fascinating there to see that connection. All right, let me bring it.
I put it another way, Kurt. I mean,
sure.
One of the things we've been looking at ideologies. The French Revolutionary ideas against the American Revolution's ideas. But you could equally say, among the other factors, are the rise of the so-called managerial elite, and that's part of, let's say, the Washington establishment. It's nothing to do with ideas. But the managerial elite has a real disdain for ordinary people. So they are educated, looking down on the uneducated rubes. They are secular, looking down on people, as President Obama said, who cling to God and their guns. And you could go on down the line. And this is behind things like Hillary Clinton's disdain for the basket of deplorables. You can see across the Western world a managerial elite. Now, they happen to be mostly secular and progressive too, but it's not ideological that's behind it. It's more they're experts and everyone else are dumb amateurs who need to understand what they know, and the expert knows best. This is extremely dangerous. Now, obviously, if I understand your series, they make fun of all that, but
right.
You need to see some of the roots of it. It's not just that Trump is, Trump appealed to people who've been forgotten by the managerial elites. And they're part of the America, too.
Right.
Now,
right.
You can't just appeal to them. You've got to appeal to the American Revolution, to every American citizen, and call them back to a far higher way. So we can't just have reactions to the elite disdain. That's not enough. Got to something transcends that. But many of those who disdain Trump are actually people on that managerial elite side, Obama and Clinton above all, and both of them were incredibly disdainful of ordinary Americans. No Christian should ever be like that. I mean, people point out Moses was the first servant leader in history. He served God and he served his people. And no great leader ever does anything but serve the people they lead. And so this elite disdain is absolutely disgraceful.
Yes, and you're certainly right. That comedy it was poking fun at this scenario, and one of our viewers right now, Tony, he writes, "Please make sure you're not condoning that movie." Tony, yes. What we're saying is this. What I've said is that it's one of those few movies, if the only movie ever to change genres. It's gone from comedy to a documentary, where it predicted what would happen in America, and it's happening before our eyes. So, all right, Oz, you talk about. We've talked about freedom, of course, and the status of freedom in America. You write that freedom is the absence of coercion. For a Christian like myself, might be a bit concerned that should we as Americans allow freedom to do acts which we think are very immoral to the Creator God? And where do we draw that line between which freedoms are acceptable in a society?
Well, let's understand, most people agree with a very basic definition of freedom.
Mm-hmm.
It is the ability to express your will in thought and words and action, despite resistance and despite coercion. That's a very basic thing. But then you have a lot of the distinctions that come in. As Lord Acton says, freedom is not the permission to do what you like. It's the power to do what you ought. So freedom biblically assumes truth, it assumes character, it assumes the way of the Lord, in other words, a way of life, which is friendly to freedom. And without that, just doing what you like will lead to permissiveness, license, and the end of freedom. So you're bringing in distinctions that are very, very important. But the absence of coercion is just the basic. If anyone, put it this way, I was at Oxford with Isaiah Berlin, the great Jewish philosopher. Freedom, he said, was negative and positive. Negative freedom, freedom from. No one is free if they're under the control of anyone or anything outside themselves. So a bully or a colonial oppressor or a sexual harasser, they're not free. Or say drugs, alcohol, or pornography, they're not free. You've got to start with negative freedom. Freedom from external control and coercion. But that's only half of freedom. Real freedom is not liberation, it's liberty. And that requires positive freedom, freedom for, freedom to be. And as you said, that requires truth, knowing the way of the Lord, and so on. But the trouble is, libertarian freedom, I gather you heard that in your last discussion, most libertarian freedom today is only negative. People want to be free from everything. And they don't realize that just leads to chaos and the increase of controls that come in. So we've got to have a definition of freedom that's much more realistic and robust. And you'll find that, of course, leads to the biblical view. And our Lord himself, you will know the truth, and the truth sets you free.
How do you ground this sense of freedom? Is there a room for, say, talk of having rights in your sense of freedom?
Well, of course there are rights, yes, but responsibilities. But the grounding is actually the real question. Because you take, where do people ground freedom today? Well, go back to the Bible. The alternatives to Jewish society, Israeli society, was, say, Egypt, no freedom at all. Or Babylon, no freedom at all. In Babylon, it was the stars. Move on down to the Greeks. They talked of freedom, but behind everything, take, say, the great tragedies of Sophocles and so on. Oedipus Rex, behind everything, fate, destiny, and even the gods couldn't change that. Now you think, well, that's the ancient world. Surely we believe in freedom. But actually you look at secularism today. The great secularists, Spinoza, Marx, Freud, J.B. Watson, B.F. Skinner, Jacques Monod, and come right down to the new atheists like Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris. Sam Harris's book on freedom has a puppet on the front, dangling from strings. And the fact is, there is no atheist who can give you the grounds of freedom. Because if you start with naturalistic science alone, you simply can't find freedom. All you find is determinisms, chemical, genetic, historical, social, economic, you name it. The Bible is the only place where you can actually ground freedom. And that's it sounds like an empty claim that Christians would make, or a sort of apologetic bravado. But I challenge anyone to look at the alternatives and say, where do you ground freedom? Only in the Jewish and Christian scriptures.
If Americans American Christians can point to the Bible as that source of freedom, why is it that we don't do so as much? Why is it that our first inclination is to say point to the Constitution, the Bill of Rights?
Well, remember, the Constitution is actually a nationalized, secularized form of government. And the biblical notion underlies Constitution. But people don't think first principles. In other words, they forget where these ideas come from. So you have people today talking about the death of liberalism, and often they're meaning that some of the views that came from the medieval world are no longer accepted as self-evident. Well, we don't ground our freedom from that sort of source. We ground it from the scriptures. Humans are made in the image of God. The Lord says, among other things, choose life or death, blessings or curse. He says, choose life. In other words, we have freedom. Now, we're not totally free. Of course, we're influenced genetically, historically, and, we're influenced by the generation we're born in. A lot of influences are surrounding us, but they don't determine us finally. You can never close the circle and say we're not free. Now, the trouble is, and now this is a Christian discussion, we're not getting into that today, but
Sure.
there are certain Christians who have as low a view of freedom as the secularists do. And that's tragic.
So, I'm curious to know. We've only got just a few more minutes here. If you could give a word of advice to, I know we just had the recent elections a couple weeks ago. If you had to look to 2020, what would you say to Americans about the process, the engagement of campaigning and elections?
Well, look at the overall picture. What I would say is, here in Washington, people are obsessed with the president. The never-Trumpers, the pro-Trumpers. They can't see anything else. They can't say anything else. It's a great mistake. The president, Donald Trump, is not the cause of the crisis. He's the consequence. And his election actually gives America a 4, maybe an 8 years at most, breathing space in which Americans can take the chance to say, who are we, where are we, and what do we need to put right? Now, of course, the arguments he's launched and that are launched against him become so all-consuming that people don't think straight, and all they think about is Trump, pro and con. So we've got to pray the Lord will raise up leaders and an understanding of what the real issues are, and who will be the leadership that addresses these in ways that, like Lincoln did in his time. Of course, we know, when Lincoln went to Philadelphia in 1861 on the way to being inaugurated, he literally said, you asked me if I'm going to hold the Union together. I will try, he said, and if it comes out well, it'll be my privilege, and if I fail, I may be assassinated. And of course, the next time he was in Philadelphia, it was as his body was carried through on his way back to Illinois. So there'd be an incredible cost of anyone making a proper stand today. But I think we've got to pray that the Lord will open people's eyes, the Lord will raise up leaders, and the Lord will use this breathing space for Americans to rethink and to go forward a better way. Otherwise, the nation's in trouble.
So what is America's choice? What are the options we have moving forward?
Well, as with covenantalism generally, as you see in the scripture, the trouble with the covenant, every system has its weaknesses and its strengths. Well, the weakness of covenantalism is clear. The Lord keeps his promise. Human beings don't. In other words, do you restore a covenant which is restoring the human commitment? And that's what needs to happen in America today, both in the church, certainly, but also in the nation. Do Americans understand the nature of freedom as their founders set it up, and are they willing to assume and shoulder the responsibility for it today? And in the light of that, can they tackle the problems that are very clear in America today, and so on? But that takes leadership to point it out. I have a question to myself. Even if there were a Lincoln-like leader in our time, would it, if such a call was made, would it have sufficient resonance among the American people? I mean, I sometimes go to our local mall when I need something, and you watch people flying around, going into the cinema or into shops with their Slurpees in their hands and so on. When I come back, I say to my wife, does the present generation really have the capacity to be the citizens that the framers assumed and required? And I think many people, quite frankly, don't. But that's the big question for me. Even if you had such a leader, would there be a resonance among the people in response? I don't know. Only the Lord knows that.
How about that? Oz, before I let you go here, what's the next writing project on your desk?
I've actually just sent a very different book into the publishers called Carpe Diem Regained, which in essence is the reassertion of a biblical view of time, because that's incredibly important. I believe we're in a kind of Augustinian moment, and we need to have a vision, rather like his vision of the city of God, city of man. We need to have a vision of the great Christian foundational truths which the church must live out if we're to go through whatever period follows. It may even be a kind of new dark ages. So it's a book on time and history and the worthwhileness of doing the right thing, even if you're a tiny minority and no one else seems to be doing it.
Yeah, great. Oh, that'll be interesting. And yeah, like you said, something a little different, but I'm sure it'll be good, and we'll definitely have to stay in touch. Oz, I want to ask you if you could stay on the line, on the phone line here. I'd like to touch base with you on something shortly after I close out the program here. That would be great. But
by all means.
Great. Oz, thank you for joining us on our program today. If you want to learn more
Real privilege.
Thank you. If you want to learn more about Oz and the work, his writing and speaking, you can go to osguinness.com. And if you are curious about that Guinness last name, there is a connection there back in Oz's history. One last time here, I'll mention this. You can share the video here and enter to win a copy of The Last Call for Liberty, How America's Genius for Freedom Has Become Its Greatest Threat. It's definitely a book everyone should consider purchasing. We're going to put a link at the post on our website when we embed today's episode. Just a truly wonderful author, thinker, and a great Christian man as well, Os Guinness. All right, well, that does it for our show today. Next week, we're talking with Art Bamford on navigating the digital age, and especially for parents who might be interested in what to do with their kids. Next week, you might want to tune in on that. Well, that does it for the show today. I'm grateful for the continued support of our patrons and the partnerships that we have with our sponsors. And as Chris cues that up, they are Defenders Media, Consult Kevin, The Sky Floor, Rethinking Hell, the Illinois Family Institute, Fox Restoration, and nonprofit Megaphone. I want to thank our technical producer today, Chris, and our very special guest, Os Guinness. And last but not least, I want to thank you for listening in and for striving for truth on faith, politics, and society.
You've been listening to Veracity Hill, striving for truth on faith, politics, and society. This is a listener-supported program. For more resources, including past shows, visit veracityhill.com.